Ladies and gentlemen, there is a reality many strong people never talk about publicly. They are the dependable ones, the calm voices in the storm, the people others call when life falls apart. They carry responsibilities without complaint, absorb pressure without recognition, and continue moving long after their emotional reserves are depleted. From the outside, they appear disciplined, capable, even unshakable. But internally, many of them are exhausted in ways words cannot fully explain. What makes this especially dangerous is that strong people often believe they are not allowed to become tired. Somewhere along the journey, they adopted the belief that their value is connected to how much they can endure. They learned to suppress emotion, postpone rest, and keep functioning regardless of what was happening inside. Over time, strength stopped being a gift and became an identity they felt forced to protect. Psychologically, this creates a profound inner conflict. The human mind was named, however, designed to operate under endless pressure without renewal. Even the strongest personality eventually begins to feel the effects of emotional overload. Fatigue changes the way people think. It clouds judgment, weakens hope, and quietly drains meaning from everyday life. A person can still smile, still work, still fulfill obligations, while internally feeling disconnected from joy, purpose, and peace. And this is where many people misunderstand what exhaustion truly means. They assume tiredness is evidence of failure. They think if they were stronger spiritually, mentally, or emotionally, they would never feel overwhelmed. But exhaustion is not always a sign that you are losing. Sometimes it is evidence that you have been carrying more than any human being was meant to carry alone. There is a philosophical truth woven deeply into human existence. Anything constantly poured out must eventually be refilled. A mind without rest becomes anxious. A heart without restoration becomes new. B. A soul without communion with God becomes dry. You cannot continuously give strength to everyone else while neglecting your own inner life and expect to remain whole. One of the greatest misconceptions about strong people is that they do not need support. In reality, strong individuals often suffer silently because everyone assumes they are fine. People admire their resilience while remaining blind to their loneliness. And over time, the strong person begins to believe the lie that vulnerability is weakness. So they hide the pressure. They hide the fear. They hide the emotional fatigue. But hidden exhaustion does not disappear. It grows quietly beneath the surface until eventually the soul begins to cry out for relief. This is often the moment when God begins to work most deeply. Notice something throughout life. God frequently meets people at the edge of their strength, not at the height of their confidence. Why? Because exhaustion has a way of exposing truth success often hid. Bias. When you are tired, you stop pretending. You stop relying on image management. You stop believing you can control everything through sheer effort and discipline alone. And that is not destruction. That is revelation. Sometimes God allows strong people to become weary because weariness creates space for dependence on Him. As long as you believe your own strength is sufficient, you will continue carrying burdens you were never intended to carry by yourself. But when fatigue humbles the heart, perspective changes. You begin to realize that your identity was never supposed to be built on constant performance. Your worth was never meant to depend on how much pain you could tolerate in silence. The deeper truth is this: even strong people need restoration. Even leaders need healing. Even disciplined minds need peace. There comes a moment when God lovingly interrupts the cycle of endless striving and says, "You cannot continue living this way if you are going to rise higher." Because higher callings require deeper foundations. And perhaps that is why some of the strongest individuals experience seasons where everything slows down. Their energy fades, their emotions become heavier, their motivation weakens. It feels confusing at first, but often those moments are not punishment. They are preparation. God is not abandoning them in exhaustion. He is teaching them that real strength is not the absence of weakness. Real strength is learning to remain grounded in faith when your own human ability is no longer enough. And sometimes the most powerful thing a strong person can do is finally admit they are tired, because that honesty becomes the beginning of transformation. One of the most difficult lessons strong people ever learn is that human strength has limits. For years, many of them survive by discipline, intelligence, endurance, and determination. They become experts at solving problems, carrying responsibilities, and pushing through emotional pain without stopping. Fine G. And for a while that approach appears successful. It earns respect. It creates achievement. It builds the image of stability. But eventually, life introduces a burden that self-reliance alone cannot sustain. This is where many people encounter a crisis they never expected. Not because they are weak, but because they have spent too much of life depending entirely on themselves. There is a difference between responsibility and self-dependence. Responsibility is healthy, but self-dependence can quietly become a form of control, where a person believes everything rests on their shoulders alone. And psychologically, that creates enormous pressure because the mind begins to operate under the illusion that rest is dangerous and surrender is failure. What makes this even more complex is that strong individuals often trust themselves more easily than they trust God. They may believe in God intellectually, but emotionally they continue living as if survival depends entirely on their own effort. So they overwork, overthink, overanalyze, and overcarry. They become mentally exhausted because they are attempting to manage outcomes no human being can fully control. And then something happens that their strength cannot fix. Sometimes it is disappointment, sometimes loss, sometimes betrayal, sometimes emotional burnout so deep they no longer recognize themselves. The methods that once kept them stable suddenly stop working. The confidence they relied on begins to crack. And in those moments, many strong people feel ashamed because they interpret their collapse as failure. But spiritually, something entirely different may be happening. There are moments when God allows exhaustion to expose the illusion of self-sufficiency. Not to humiliate you, but to free you. Because as long as a person believes they must carry every burden alone, they remain trapped in anxiety, fear, and emotional isolation. The soul was never designed to function independently from God. Human beings possess intelligence, ambition, and resilience, but none of those qualities can replace spiritual dependence. This is why some of the deepest transformations occur during seasons people would normally describe as breaking points. When your plans fail, when your emotions become too heavy to hide, when your strength no longer feels reliable, you are forced into a question many people spend their entire lives avoiding. What am I truly depending on? That question changes everything. Philosophically, suffering has a unique ability to dismantle false identities. A person may spend years believing they are valuable because they are productive, needed, or emotionally invulnerable. But exhaustion strips away performance and forces the individual to confront who they are beneath achievement. And that process can feel deeply uncomfortable because it challenges the ego's need for control. Yet this is often where God does his greatest work, because surrender is not weakness. Surrender is alignment. It is the recognition that human wisdom has boundaries and that true peace cannot come from controlling every outcome. Strong people often resist surrender because they associate it with passivity. But spiritual surrender is not passive at all. It requires humility, courage, and trust. It means continuing forward while releasing the obsessive need to control every detail of life. And ironically, many people do not discover God's strength until their own strength begins to fail. That is the paradox of spiritual growth. When people feel strongest, they often rely most heavily on themselves. But when they become tired, humbled, and emotionally honest, they become more open to divine guidance. Their hearts soften, their perspective deepens, their priorities change. They stop chasing constant validation and begin seeking lasting peace. There is also a psychological freedom that emerges when a person stops believing they must carry the entire world alone. Anxiety decreases when control decreases. Fear loses power when trust increases. The mind becomes healthier when it no longer lives under relentless internal pressure. And this is one reason many exhausted individuals eventually emerge wiser than before. Pain forced them into truths comfort would never have taught them. God does not waste exhaustion. He uses it to reshape identity. He uses it to teach dependence instead of pride, faith instead of fear, wisdom instead of illusion. And while the process may feel painful, it often becomes the very thing that prepares a person for a higher level of emotional and spiritual maturity. Because sometimes God will allow your strength to run out so you can finally discover that his strength was always greater than yours. One of the greatest misconceptions people carry through life is the belief that painful seasons automatically mean they are moving backward. When strong people become exhausted, discouraged, or emotionally overwhelmed, they often assume something has gone wrong. They interpret hardship as evidence of failure, weakness, or abandonment. But many times, the very season that feels like collapse is actually the beginning of transformation. Human beings naturally resist discomfort because the mind seeks stability and predictability. We want clarity, control, and immediate understanding. Yet growth rarely occurs in comfort. Psychological maturity is often formed through tension, uncertainty, and adversity. A person does not discover the depth of their character during easy seasons. Character is revealed when familiar support systems disappear and life no longer unfolds according to expectation. This is especially true for strong individuals because strength can sometimes create hidden pride. Not always arrogance in the obvious sense, but a subtle belief that discipline, intelligence, or persistence can protect them from deep suffering. And then life introduces a situation they cannot outwork, outthink, or outmaneuver. Suddenly they face high emotional pain that refuses to disappear quickly. Their confidence weakens. Their direction becomes unclear. And for the first time in a long while, they feel vulnerable. Yet vulnerability has a purpose. Some of the most profound changes in human life begin when a person reaches the limits of who they used to be. Philosophically, every transformation requires a form of death. Old thinking must die. False identities must die. Illusions of control must die. Otherwise, a person remains trapped inside outdated patterns that can no longer carry them into the future God intends for them. This is why painful seasons often feel disorienting. God is not merely changing your circumstances, He is reshaping you internally. An internal transformation is rarely comfortable because it requires confronting truths people spend years avoiding. Exhaustion exposes emotional wounds. Disappointment exposes misplaced priorities. Isolation exposes dependency on external validation. Failure exposes where identity was built on achievement instead of deeper spiritual foundations. But here is what many people miss. God does some of His finest work in hidden seasons. The world celebrates visible success, but God often prepares people in private before elevating them publicly. There are lessons learned in loneliness that cannot be learned in crowds. There is wisdom gained through suffering that comfort could never produce. And there is a depth of faith developed through uncertainty that easy seasons rarely create. Consider how often emotionally exhausted people emerge with greater compassion afterward. Before pain, they may have understood suffering intellectually. After pain, they understand it personally. Their hearts become softer. Their judgments become wiser. Their perspective becomes deeper. What once appeared simple now reveals complexity. And this is one reason adversity often produces emotional maturity in ways success alone cannot. Psychologically, hardship also strips away I. Spend years pursuing things they believe will finally satisfy them: recognition, status, control, approval. But suffering has a way of revealing what truly matters. When life becomes difficult, superficial priorities lose their power. People begin searching for peace instead of applause, meaning instead of image, purpose instead of performance. And that shift is often the beginning of elevation. Because God does not define elevation the way the world does. The world associates elevation with power, money, influence, or external achievement. But spiritual elevation begins internally. It begins when a person becomes emotionally disciplined instead of emotionally reactive. It begins when humility replaces ego. It begins when wisdom becomes more important than appearance. A person can rise externally while remaining broken internally. But God's process focuses first on the condition of the soul. This is why some of the strongest people experience prolonged seasons of difficulty before stepping into greater purpose. Preparation requires development. A higher calling demands greater emotional capacity, deeper faith, and stronger character. Without those qualities, success can destroy a person instead of strengthen them. And perhaps that is why certain doors close unexpectedly. Certain relationships fall apart. Certain plans fail despite enormous effort. In the moment, it feels painful and confusing. But often God is removing what no longer aligns with the person you are becoming. He is teaching you to stop clinging to what is familiar so you can grow into what is necessary. The tragedy is that many people quit during the transformation process because they mistake discomfort for defeat. They do not realize that breaking points are often turning points. The exhaustion, confusion, and emotional struggle may actually be evidence that something deeper is being rebuilt within them. Because sometimes your lowest moment is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the place where God finally prepares you to rise higher than you ever could have imagined. There comes a moment in every person's life when remaining the same becomes more painful than changing. And when God begins calling someone higher, the invitation is not simply about achieving more. It is about becoming different. That is the part many people resist. They want elevation without transformation. They want new doors while holding on to old habits, old fears, old identities, and old ways of thinking. But growth does not work that way. A higher calling always demands a higher version of the person responding to it. This is why seasons of exhaustion, surrender, and transformation are so important. They prepare the inner life for what the outer life may eventually require. Because if a person rises externally without growing internally, success becomes dangerous. Influence without wisdom creates pride. Opportunity without emotional discipline creates instability. Achievement without spiritual grounding creates emptiness. God is not merely interested in changing your circumstances. He is interested in changing you. And one of the clearest signs that God is calling you higher is that certain things no longer fit your spirit the way they once did. Conversations that once entertained you now feel draining. Environments that once felt comfortable now feel limiting. Relationships built on dysfunction become difficult to tolerate. Why? Because growth changes perception. As emotional and spiritual maturity increase, the soul becomes less willing to settle for what keeps it trapped. Psychologically, human beings are creatures of familiarity. Even unhealthy patterns can feel safe simply because they are known. This is why many people remain connected to toxic cycles long after recognizing the damage they cause. The fear of uncertainty becomes stronger than the desire for freedom. And when God begins leading a person higher, one of the first battles they face is internal resistance to change. Because growth often requires loss before it produces gain. Sometimes you must leave environments where you are constantly diminished. Sometimes you must release relationships rooted in manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional dependency. Sometimes you must walk away from old versions of yourself that were built entirely around survival rather than purpose. And none of that is easy. Human beings become emotionally attached not only to people, but also to identities. A person who spent years being the strong one may struggle to embrace vulnerability. Someone who built their identity around achievement may feel lost when God begins teaching them peace instead of performance. Someone accustomed to controlling everything may find it difficult to trust divine timing. Yet these inner shifts are essential because higher levels of purpose require different emotional foundations. This is why discipline becomes so important. Not merely external discipline, but internal discipline. The discipline to guard your thoughts. The discipline to stop feeding fear. The discipline to reject bitterness after disappointment. The discipline to remain faithful even when progress feels slow. Emotionally mature people understand that feelings are real, but they are not always reliable guides. A person cannot rise higher while remaining controlled by every impulse, insecurity, or temporary emotion. And perhaps one of the greatest signs of spiritual growth is the ability to maintain peace in situations that once would have destroyed your stability. That kind of peace does not come from perfect circumstances. It comes from deeper trust. It comes from understanding that God's direction is often clearer in hindsight than in the present moment. Strong people sometimes struggle with this because they want certainty before obedience. They want every answer before taking the next step. But faith rarely operates that way. Faith requires movement before full by standing. And that is where many people miss their next level. They wait until fear disappears before acting. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is movement despite uncertainty. It is the willingness to rise even while your emotions are still catching up with your calling. The truth is, God's higher calling will often separate you from comfortable limitations. It will challenge your mindset, expose your weaknesses, and force you to grow beyond emotional habits that once defined your life. But this process is not meant to break you. It is meant to prepare you. Because every season you survived carried a lesson. Every disappointment taught discernment. Every betrayal taught wisdom. Every moment of exhaustion taught dependence on God instead of dependence on self. Nothing was wasted. And eventually, you begin to realize that the struggle was never just about survival. It was preparation for elevation. So when God calls you higher, do not cling to the version of yourself. If that existed before the process began. Rise differently, think differently, trust differently, live differently. The pain shaped you, but it was never meant to imprison you. Because the people God calls higher are not the ones who never became tired. They are the ones who allowed exhaustion to transform them instead of destroy them.